Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Harry Ward Lecture of 2021 on behalf of the Guild of Freemen of the City of York. It has been a difficult year this year and last, but I am asking you tonight to pull up your chair with the beverage of your choice and enjoy this lecture by Mr. Bruce Harrison, one of our court members. He is an amateur archaeologist and has been on digs in France and locally in Yorkshire, and I'm hoping he'll have lots of splendid tales for us. I will hand you over now to Bruce. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the Guild of Freemen of the City of York Harry Ward Memorial Lecture for 2021. My name is Bruce Harrison, and this is an account of my search for prehistoric man entitled "And Did Those Feet in Ancient Times." The first half of the talk will be about inspiration and hands-on experience in archaeological excavations, and the second part will be what began as a pastime but really developed into a 25-year research programme. In 1972, 50 years after Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, the British Museum put on an exhibition, The Treasures of Tutankhamun. It was hugely popular, widely acclaimed, and I was very fortunate as a boy to travel to the British Museum with my mother and take part in the endless queues that seemed to be around at the time. Some people queued up for 6 to 8 hours. We managed a mere 3 hours, but nevertheless it was hard work on a hot day, but well worth the experience to see, amongst other things, probably the most famous archaeological artifact in the world, the funerary mask of King Tutankhamun. 100 years before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, a stone that had been found in 1799 by French Napoleonic soldiers and had been brought a little later to the British Museum, where it remains on display today after more than 200 years. The Rosetta Stone turned out to be the key that unlocked the secret of the hieroglyphs that were carved onto most every tomb and monument throughout Egypt, and by doing so they pushed back the borders of time between the prehistoric and the historic in Egypt by several thousand years. About the time that the ancient Egyptians were inventing hieroglyphs, our own Stonehenge was in construction. It bears no cartouches or hieroglyphs. We know not the names of the people who instigated it, who built it, or indeed any instructions as to why they built it and how we might interpret it. But I don't think anybody could argue that the people, being illiterate, nevertheless left their mark. Likewise, if you look at this aerial photograph, which shows crop marks, we can see that these people have left their mark, whoever they were. A farmer might look at this field and think, well, this is a rather poor crop of spring barley. It's short of magnesium and manganese, could do with a certain amount of fertilizer and a nice warm shower to waken it up. An archaeologist, of course, would look upon this in quite a different way, but both those statements are to a degree speculative and would require further analysis, either of the soil in the farmer's case or in an excavation in the archaeologist's case. Apart from a few references from ancient Greeks and the Romans prior to their invasion, we actually have no written history of our islands prior to the Roman invasion, so we can only really guess as to what went on in Iron Age times and before. In the late 1970s, as a teenager, I had the opportunity of taking part in archaeological excavations in northeast France in the Champagne region. This was a joint collaboration between French and English archaeologists, and we were collectively looking for Iron Age remains, or early Roman perhaps on occasions, and for those of you wondering, I am the one in the flat cap. The reason we were excavating in northeast France was because we were looking for parallels between the cultures on the continent and those that were in East Yorkshire, on the East Yorkshire Wolds in particular. This map doesn't seem to quite extend as far as the East Yorkshire Wolds, but it gives you an idea that the Iron Age cultures of Laten and Hallstatt, named after the original towns where these excavation layers were determined and dated, were spread throughout the continent and beyond. Being in northeast France, of course, as a teenager, was not all about archaeology. I learned a great deal about the routier cafes and their menus. We had a lot of social activity. There was a team game football between the diggers and one of the local villages that happened quite a lot. Invitations were extended from local farmhouses for lucky people, and I was one of the fortunate people. And for the grown-ups, that is the archaeologists, their sought-after invitation was to be invited to a local professional's home nearby who kept a clandestine collection of Iron Age and Roman artifacts. Such a thing was, of course, frowned upon by the authorities in France, but nevertheless, where trust was gained, people were invited to share the collection and see what they made of it. Rainy days were spent having a look round the cathedrals such as Reims, or Reims as they call it locally, Soissons, Amiens, Beauvais, Laon, amongst others, and the battlefields were not far away. Verdun was within driving distance, where sadly the French army were besieged in 1916. Sedan, where one of the great battles of the Franco-Prussian War took place, and Bastogne in southern Belgium was even within distance, which was the site of the Battle of the Bulge in the Second World War. However, the archaeology was good. There were a great many grave goods to be found, unlike the Yorkshire Wolds, where there would be hundreds and hundreds of graves, and many of them didn't have that much to show for them, and so it was a fruitful exercise in terms of attempting to examine the cultures that may be parallel with one and the other. There were other accidental finds which might more fall in the category of treasure, and here you will see a hoard of Roman coins still in situ, found in a stubble field in a pot at Ville-sur-Ytourne. Here is my first experience of digging a grave, what was known as a niche grave. I can tell you it was very deep, had an awful lot of soil to come out of it, tediously, along with scraping back with a trowel to find ostensibly nothing at the bottom, but in fact the body had been pushed sideways in a niche that had been made specially for the purpose, and although it's not shown on this photograph, you could see the antler pick marks on the underside of the niche where the workmen had taken the trouble to dig out the niche. This is Gallo-Roman rather than Iron Age, but nevertheless this was my first grave. Although not stated, the underlying quest behind certainly the English director of things, which was Dr. Ian Stead, was that we were looking for, if we could possibly find one, a chariot burial. The archaeologists rather frown on the term chariot burial. They call them cart burials, or if they have four wheels, then wagon burials. But the romantic and the press and the rest of us like to think of them as chariot burials. We didn't actually find a chariot burial. The nearest we came to such a thing was on the right there. You can see a tyre from a chariot, an iron tyre that would have gone round a wooden rimmed and spoked wheel, and on the left is essentially a chariot shaped hole. You can see the slots where the wheels would have gone at the back, and even the hubs of the back axle at the top of the picture there are cut out in the grave. This grave was robbed. You can see that there are at least 2 skeletons there, all in a jumble, and we learned studying those that the bodies that had been placed in the tomb with the chariot, and who knows what grave goods had been disturbed within a few months of their interment. We know that because the limbs had come apart from the torsos, but they were still articulated in themselves. There was a tiny scrap of gold in that grave, and we can only guess as to what else was taken out. Ironically, the first year that the diggers went out to excavate in France was 1971, and in that particular year there was a chariot burial discovered in Garton Slack on the Yorkshire Wolds. It was the first, the only chariot burial to have been excavated in modern times of the Arras type, the culture that exists on the Yorkshire Wolds. All previous chariot burials or cart burials had been excavated in Victorian times or earlier. This was excavated by Tony Brewster, who held a very special place on that account. Some years later, in 1984, in Wetwang Slack, which is in fact a continuation of Garton Slack, another chariot burial was discovered in the gravel that sits in the bottom of the slack. The gravel lends itself to a lot of deposits, graves, cemeteries, and a well-drained place for people to have their roundhouses and so on. This particular burial was clipped by the navvy driver, who was one of the few people alive who'd seen the one in 1971 and therefore recognised it, and he alerted the authorities accordingly. The first I knew of it was when Ian Stead of the British Museum rang me up, and he was very excited. He'd written his doctoral thesis on the Arras culture and the Iron Age chariot burials there too. He'd never excavated one before, never had the opportunity, as the only one, as I said earlier, was in 1971, and he wasn't involved in that. But he rang up particularly for me to get a message to his friend Tony Pesito, who'd been a co-director of the excavations in France and a long-time friend and collaborator with Ian Stead. Tony Pesito lived about a mile from me. He was a man who could take a television set apart and put it back together again. He was a man who had a foundry, blacksmith shop, a lathe. He could make anything you like. He would set off, and he did, certainly on one occasion when I rode with him to drive to France, in his Bedford van with a spare engine in the back. And he remarked that, well, he wasn't sure if the cylinder head would last all the way to France, but he would stick another one on if need be. And he wasn't sure about the water pump, and even the whole engine might well be replaced. And he could do this in a stubble field or anywhere else, and he was an invaluable member of any archaeological excavation. But the one anomaly on his radar, despite being a radio ham and being technologically very capable, he didn't agree with telephones. So if you wanted to get a message immediately to Tony, then the way the British Museum did it was through me. And so I was invited to go along and help in this rescue excavation to excavate this particular chariot burial, which was supposed to have been across the weekend. Here is that chariot burial. You will see the navvy in the background that clipped the edge of it. They piled up gravel so as the archaeologists had something to stand on at the side, but you can see a dismantled chariot or cart with a skeleton in the middle of it, with a sword laid down the length of the torso of the skeleton. And whilst you can't really see them in black and white photograph here, there are spearheads and other grave implements. You will see on the left that the spokes of the wheel, one of the wheels, is standing out. That's because there was a cavity there in the soil, and they pumped foam into those cavities in order to preserve the outline of the rims and the spokes of the wheel. Despite the discreet and secret nature of our excavations, news reached the outside world, and we had, for a while, we were mobbed by the paparazzi, the media. We were filmed by television and others. We were photographed by the press, the media of all sorts, and various of our number were interviewed on the radio, and I think probably the television as well. And that handsome character there in the white shorts is, well, I'll leave it for you to decide that. John Dent, who was the director of affairs and on the East Riding, he was interviewed on the radio, and he was asked to describe what were these cart burials like. And he said, well, it looks as if somebody's had an accident with a bicycle. And indeed, that's what they do look like, really. And because some of them have pig bones in amongst them, I'm not sure if it was the interviewer or another archaeologist observed that maybe it was an accident with a bicycle when they ran over a pig. You will see there are 3 burials here. The first one, number 1, you've already seen. Burial number 2 was the one that I ended up excavating, and burial 3, embarrassingly, turned up a few weeks later, having been unnoticed at the time, and that too was clipped by the navvy, so the archaeologists had to go back and excavate that one. But you will see the one in the middle, number 2, is the only one of the 3 that was intact and unmolested by the navvy. And here is Wetwang Chariot Burial number 2. On the left you will see that there is a partial excavation where the area around the grave has been cleaned back. The edges of the grave have been determined, and you can see, if you look very carefully, that there is a faint outline of the superstructure of a chariot, a sort of oblong affair, and to the right and left of that are the edges of the wheels rims just coming up, and at the far end of the grave is the pole, or at least the remnant of the mark of a pole that was there. On the right is the excavated version before anything has been taken out. Such was the habit back then of excavations, that you got as far as you could. You exposed all the grave goods as much as you were able. You took photographs, and then you started removing bones and grave goods, and you went on to find out whether there was anything else underneath. This is another view before the goods were taken out. This is yours truly and another tidying up the grave area. And these are photographs that were featured in popular archaeology, as you will see, more than a year later actually. And this is during the excavation again. You might wonder why all these photographs are black and white. Well, I can tell you the reason is that back then colour photography was expensive. There was no digital photography. Photographs were largely taken and developed in-house by Tony Pasito, the many-skilled individual, and only when things were really tidied up did they go to the expense of having colour photographs. Private individuals, of course, could take colour photographs, and they did, but the publications tended to be in black and white as well, so there was not much to be said for wasting money on colour photographs at the time, rightly or wrongly. And you will see me on the left delicately trying to tease out the different objects in the grave, and you will see on the right, if you have good eyesight, you can see some horse bits, the ends of some horse bits turning up, and behind those loops there is actually a mirror, and behind that is what became known as a bean tin, and in the further behind that you can see the wheel hub, the bronze wheel hub turning up. All of these objects, of course, needed conservation, and the British Museum sent their conservators and they gathered everything up, including the bean tin, which I christened at the time, which you will see a little later on. The last time I saw any of these objects, be it in their raw state or actually in a cleaned up state, well, actually, I've never seen them in a cleaned up state, but in their raw state, the last time I saw them was in the back of our pickup, and along with the two British Museum conservators, taken to Driffield, to the Bell Inn, where they decanted them and dealt with them and took them off down to London. Here are some of the objects later on, when they were actually on display in Hull Museum, which I'm not sure if they're back now, but they were taken away again for some further remedial activity, consolidating what had been done previously. The mirror actually isn't part of that particular grave number 2 that I excavated. The mirror comes from another chariot burial, but it's representative of something similar that was found in that grave. Top left of the photograph you will see terret rings, which are rain rings in ordinary parlance, and those white discs that are on, those white studs, are in fact Mediterranean coral, and when they were first exposed to the light they were a pink colour, and after about 20 minutes their colour disappeared and they were bleached back to completely white. So if you'd not been there at that particular time, you would never have seen the pink colour. Their original colour, I think, would have been a very vivid red. Top right, you can see the bean tin when it's been cleaned up, and you can see some very delicate and very typical Latin Celtic scrolly engraving by way of decoration. Here is an artist's impression of the ceremonial that may have gone on when they buried these people. Perhaps I should have said earlier, but the burial that I undertook, which might be indicated by the mirror, was of a woman. And the other two at Wetwang on that occasion were men with swords, and mine was a woman with other ceremonial goods and accoutrements. This is the, as typical, team photograph at the end of the dig, which was supposed to have taken a fortnight. It actually took 2 weeks. On the left you will see the 3 main archaeologists, which were John Dent on the left, Ian Stead in the middle, and Tony Pasito on the right, and they are making a playful tribute to their forebears and counterparts of the 19th century, who were Boynton, Mortimer and Greenwell respectively, who were the ones who first discovered, or at least they were formative in their activities in excavating Iron Age burials and defining the Arras culture as we now know it. As is the habit, of course, we are there swilling champagne down from our coffee mugs at something that was to mark the end of something that was really very exciting at the time. At the time of our excavations, some of you may remember, it was during the same period, York Minster caught fire, the south transept was on fire, and very shortly afterwards, another thing which some of you may remember was that Lindau Bogman was discovered in a Cheshire bog, and Ian Stead, our London director, he went off to involve himself in that. And the reason that I've included this is because on the right is an impression created by Richard Neve of what an Iron Age man looked like at the time. Not much different really to lockdown man of the moment, I would suggest. Perhaps a bit tidier. Having done the pioneer work, I went back to my day job on the farm, and the archaeologists went off and discovered further chariot burials. There was another one discovered at Garton Station and another one at Kirkburn, sometime in the late 80s, I believe, followed by another one in Wetwang village, which was discovered, unearthed during the building of a cul-de-sac development within the village rather than down in the slack. There was even one discovered near Edinburgh, Newbridge, in 2001. Then came the last of those that are mentioned on this particular map, which was at Ferry Fryson near Ferrybridge during the construction of a slip road to the A1, I think it was. They were all over the place after a while. In fact, in Pocklington, one turned up in 2017 as part of a archaeological survey prior to a development of a housing estate. And that was followed by yet another one in Pocklington on the Mile. Similarly, the difference with the two at Pocklington was, as you saw, the previous one had 2 horses buried with it, and this one had 2 horses and a chariot already intact rather than dismantled, and the horses here were arranged such that they looked as though they were sort of about to leap out of the grave. These were very unusual things. Normally, chariot burials were not discovered with horses. I mean, we call them horses, but I suppose in modern parlance you would call them ponies, really, rather than the sort of Ben-Hur things you're used to in Hollywood. These things were about 13 hands-ish, so they were bigger than Shetland ponies, smaller than Dartmoor or Exmoor ponies, perhaps nearer something akin to a New Forest pony. About the same time as the second chariot burial at Pocklington was being excavated, there was another one found in Pembrokeshire. One of the only, the one in Edinburgh and the one in Pembrokeshire are the only two really to have been found in England or in the UK outside the relatively small area of the East Yorkshire Wolds. In the midst of all this, the Royal Archaeological Institute held an annual conference in 2017, which was hosted at, I think, the Hospitium in the Museum Gardens in York, and along with it went a special exhibition in the Yorkshire Museum of the artefacts of the past 200 years of Arras culture burials, which included some of the original Arras culture artefacts, which are permanently housed at the Yorkshire Museum, I think some of the other Arras culture items are in the whole museum, and I think some are down in London. But this particular conference was timed to celebrate 200 years of excavating the Arras culture from 1817 to 2017. This is notwithstanding that the following year and the year after further chariot burials were discovered, but Peter Holken, he managed to put together the different papers and edited them into a book, which you will see him holding there. And there are no prizes for guessing which chariot burial of that 200-year period is featured on the front cover. And just in case you were thinking chariot burials were confined to East Yorkshire mainly, actually they're spread over Europe. There was a Thracian wagon burial, that's a four-wheeled version, found in Bulgaria in 2008. There is, of course, the Tutankhamun chariot, which you will note is 6-spoked, as opposed to the 12-spoke variety that tends to be the case. And more recently, there was one unearthed in Pompeii in 2021, which somebody thinks was more of a ceremonial wedding chariot because of the bronze castings on the front of it. But the granddaddy of them all is the Chinese one. Dozens of chariots and 100 or so horses were excavated in a single giant tomb in central China in 2017, and you'll see that their wheels have an awful lot more spokes to them. However, exciting though these things were for me back in 1984, I was to return back to the farm, back to the work, and back to home activity. Here is a view looking from the crest of the Howardian Hills across the Vale of Pickering to the North York Moors in the distance. Another from the brow of the hill looking down into the bottom of the vale. And a bit nearer to the bottom of the vale. And here is a view from the flat bottom of the vale post-harvest in a blank field. These fields have no obvious prehistoric features to them. Yes, there are a few crop markings that come up from time to time. They tend to be Iron Age or possibly the odd squiggle that may be a bit earlier, none of which have been excavated. Practically all of the British Isles has been settled for thousands of years. The traces of this occupation are often hard to find. Sometimes all that's left of a prehistoric settlement is a scatter of work flint in the soil of a ploughed field. And as a principle, the archaeologist should expect to find lithic artefacts throughout the country. These statements are rather more easily said than proven or perhaps acted upon. Nevertheless, when you have a large dog that decides it needs exercise every day, then whether you are crop walking your fields or whether you're field walking looking for flints or any other remains of archaeological nature, come rain or shine, it doesn't really matter. When you have an expert in all fields with you, it has to be done on a daily basis. This table is a chronology, the archaeological dates and datings. All these vary from different archaeological studies from one to another. These are really very broad datings, and they cover the sort of timings that are relevant to this particular talk. They're split into the usual Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age and Roman periods. And all you really need to do is look at that right-hand column. 1500 years, 3,500 years, 2000, 1500, 1800, and so on. And what you learn is that between the late Upper Paleolithic and the Iron Age, there is something like a 10,000 year period. Within that 10,000 year period, you have different people. You'll encounter all these again. You've come across the one on the right, Lindau man, the Iron Age man. The other ones we will see in due course, but they're quite interesting. The late Upper Paleolithic period, which in our part of the world really doesn't extend beyond 11,000 to about 9,500 BC. And it's really the final glaciation period when the glaciers were retreating from Britain, or perhaps had retreated from Britain. Hunting parties were coming north from the more temperate south, and they were roaming the landscape looking for whatever they could find, really, by way of food. Very often they were following animals, and they left a diverse array of tools with which to hunt different quarry. And the first known bows and arrows of this period date from about then. Bows and arrows may have been around before that, but these are the only ones really that we have absolute proof of. And at the end of this period, the weather took a turn for the worse, and things got really cold again, and the population was, we think, driven out of what is now the British Isles. This is just a map showing you where the final glaciation took place, and highlighting the fact that the Vale of Pickering was not under ice during the final glaciation. This means that whatever was there, it may have been covered up, but it wasn't scrubbed away by glaciers, so there is the potential of finding some quite old items. This is a map that gives you some sort of idea of the archaeological excavations and discoveries that have been made in the broader region. You can see the Yorkshire Wolds marked there, and the North York Moors, and in between the Vale of Pickering. And just below Scarborough, numbers 12 and 13 there, relate to the Paleo Lake, Flixton and Seymour Car. Starcar isn't marked. I don't think Starcar exists anymore, but they are the famous areas of excavation into the Mesolithic and earlier in our particular region, and they're famous actually throughout Europe, if not throughout the world. But you can see on this map, all those yellow dots, that there are excavations in the Vale of Mowbray and the Tees Valley, even down in the Vale of York, as well as Holderness. But in the Vale of Pickering, the excavations tend to be confined, the earlier excavations tend to be confined to the east end of the vale. Nevertheless, after a certain amount of searching, this particular item came up. I didn't know what on earth this was, but I took it to the British Museum to see if they could tell me, and what they told me was really quite a surprise. This is a long blade core, dated to between 12 and 12,500 years old, and it comes from the earliest of those periods on that chronology that I showed you, which is the late Upper Paleolithic. This is the final gasp of the old Stone Age, where they were beginning to diversify in their tool making, and really these things are very, very rare. Here are a few other items that apparently date from a similar period. Some of them were identified by Don Henson of the University of York, and some of them I've taken from types that are illustrated in lithic assemblages by Torben Ballin. And they are collectively, they come under the term, the cultural term of Ahrensbergian. Ahrensbergian is a label which is taken from Ahrensburg, which is highlighted in red on the right of the main map there, which is in northern Germany, in the direction of Denmark. And I've also highlighted the Vale of Pickering, and the important thing about this is that at the time that these artifacts were manufactured, it was possible to navigate from the Vale of Pickering to Ahrensburg overland. We were not so much apart from, but a part of mainland continental Europe at that time, and Doggerland, you will see, has been since inundated by the North Sea as the climate warmed, so the polar ice caps melted, the seas rose, the land actually rose as well without the weight of the heavy ice on it, but the seas rose a lot quicker than did the land. And by somewhere between about 8,000 and 8,500 years ago, we were severed from the mainland and we became a series of islands, the British Isles. Here is another rather rare item, which the top right photograph there is from the collection of Martin Purdeck, and is a notched arrowhead from that Upper Paleolithic period, and the bottom left photograph is the one that I picked up of a very similar type of a very remote period. The period concerned was quite a cold period, apparently. The glaciers may have been melting, but it was still quite cold. There was an element of tundra, a lot of birch and rowan. It was a bit like the Canadian Shield areas of the modern day, I suppose. And one of the most important prey that they sought after was the wild reindeer. And in that regard, they were a little bit culturally aligned to the Sami people of Lapland in northern Scandinavia these days. I'm not sure who came up with the idea, where it comes from, but it is said that the late Upper Paleolithic hunters were long-limbed people, quite tall, who roamed great distances and were very akin and similar to this illustrated on the left here, the modern hunter-gatherer from Namibia, thought to be similar to our UK counterparts of the period. In the middle is a modern Sami reindeer herder in Sweden, just to give you the idea of what reindeer like and what they were hunting. And there is an artist's impression of a Paleolithic girl on the right. As I said earlier, at the end of the late Upper Paleolithic period, the glaciers started to grow again, the climate returned to a bitter cold, and people were not able to exist in the British Isles at that time. However, when the climate did begin to revive and did begin to warm up, it actually warmed up quite quickly on occasions, and was for a period warmer, we believe, than it is now. There was therefore a repopulation of Britain after the severe climate reversal. Hunter-gatherer societies followed the seasons, followed the reindeer again, and they were thought to have existed on fishing and hunting, for which they had to develop new ways of hunting, new technologies. Along with a warming climate, of course, came trees, and here is Mesolithic flint adze of between 8 and 6,000 BC, 8 and 10,000 years old basically. This was again identified by the kind people, Dr. Gild Cook and the late Roger Jacoby at the British Museum. And this was a surprise to me, that it was so very old. It's an odd-looking thing, and like a chameleon, it is very difficult to spot something like this on the ground. It blends in very easily. It's all rather lumpy and ugly, so it's been drawn out on the right to show you the general shape. It would have been hafted at 90 degrees to the handle and used like a modern adze now, with a slightly less sophisticated, though no less clever in its execution, blade. And here we have the diagnostic forms which relate to the early Mesolithic. The bottom left, the three larger items, if you look carefully down the edges, they've got serrated blades, and they are in fact saws. They would probably have been hafted, although they needn't have been, and they were used for sawing things. The others all relate to the serious diagnostic forms of the time, which are called microliths because they're tiny things. The scale on the bottom left is the scale for the whole of them. Microliths are able to be dated, really. They varied over a very long period, and here are some of those variations. And the larger pieces are the core pieces from which the microliths have been struck. Here are three typical different classifications of microliths. The older ones, the earlier ones, are called broad blade microliths or Maglemosian types, and the second two lines are the later ones, which are often referred to as narrow blade microliths because they got smaller and smaller, and they are Sauveterrian types, which is named after a type site in France. And the bottom ones are again another later variation where they become broader again, but they're still nevertheless the later forms. And here we have examples that have all been gathered up by myself of those different forms, showing you how very much older some of the top ones are. They're again Maglemosian, and the more recent ones below. If you're wondering what microliths are all about, well, this is an illustration. These arrows on the right have been unearthed from a bog in southern Sweden, and they show you that there are these tiny shards of flint that were used for arrow points and for barbs, and in fact they were used for all sorts of things over a long period of time. The earlier ones were, as I said, Maglemosian, which are Danish in their cultural identification, and it makes sense that when there was no North Sea, you could walk from top of Jutland right across to Yorkshire, so it makes sense that they had an allied culture. And the bottom left shows you a broad blade early Mesolithic flint point, and alongside it a .303 caliber bullet, which was really their version of the hunting weapon of the moment. And this is what we are led to believe is what Mesolithic man looked like. There was the most complete skeleton of a Mesolithic man discovered in the Cheddar Gorge, in the Cheddar Cave, and this is a reconstruction of a Mesolithic man with blue eyes, dark skin and dark hair. The later Mesolithic really is split out because it follows the period when we became an island group. So we started a culture that was insular and separate from continental Europe. The climate cut us off, and then we developed quite distinctly and quite different. The forests began to grow and flourish, and the flora and fauna developed quite differently, and the items that people lived on, particularly back then, were elk, deer, pig and beaver, as well as bird life and fish. Mesolithic tools, which includes tools from the early Mesolithic, which is the top left, the broad blade culture as you see, and the ones on the top right are the narrow blade culture. That was when we became an isolated island and we started to go our own way in the way we did things and how we developed, and it's indicative that we became a forest dwelling culture. And the bottom in the middle there is a little further on when we started developing other sorts of microliths, which you may remember from an earlier slide. The bottom right is a Mesolithic spearhead, and the left are just another version of microliths. And right at the end of that period, when it's a transitional thing really, the hunter-gatherers who were in their forests were overtaken with a Neolithic technology, which was agriculture. This is a late Mesolithic or possibly an early Neolithic pick. This is, if you like, a prototype plough. This was when they started to break up the ground and make something different of their environment. The Neolithic. Well, the Neolithic is all about a revolution, the development of farming, aggressive forest clearance in parts, domestication of livestock and crops, permanent settlements established, first use of pottery that we're aware of in Britain, and monumental burial sites and ceremonial sites for that matter. This is the great symbol of the Neolithic period, which is a Stone Age axe. Inevitably, if you're going to clear ground and you're in a forest, then you need an axe, and this is something that they made a great deal of use of. Sometimes referred to in folklore as thunderstones, as people believe that they had fallen from the sky, such was the unusual nature of them. This particular one I picked up in a sugar beet field, and it is deemed to be early Neolithic, Group 1 base-rich gabbro, manufactured in Cornwall. Group 1 base-rich means, gabbro means that it's full of iron, it's of a particularly identified type that comes from around Penzance, and it's made of an igneous rock, a very hard and heavy rock at that. Along with new tools came new forms of arrowhead. These are the beautifully shaped leaf arrowheads of the Neolithic. The four on the right were found as a group. The seven on the left were found as individuals here and there. And inevitably, once you have broken your ground, you've sown your seed, then you need to harvest your crop, and these top right are the remnants of sickles. The earlier sickles were composite teeth in a wooden handle. These were single piece sickles which were hafted in sort of a bent stick really. These are quite rare to be found. They tend to get broken up, as the top two pieces are two pieces of two different sickles, and the bottom one is a smaller one, a single piece sickle. As the Neolithic period progressed, so did the forms of the arrowheads and various other tools as well, for that matter. Here are the diagnostic forms that are associated with the late Neolithic, and even some of them might well have strayed into the period of the Bronze Age. These are, of course, the Neolithic version of microliths. And along with the microliths come other tool forms. The Neolithic tools tend to be chunkier and heavier, being farmer-made, as it were, less mobile in nature. There was no need for them to be light, to be carried around for great distances, they could be heavier and heavier, and the ones on the bottom right did get heavier, a little more crude in their formation as the time went on. And this slide is meant to illustrate the comparative sizes and nature, the differences between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic that followed. If you look at the top left, two items are hammer stones from the Neolithic or Bronze Age, along with some cresting flakes to their right, which are manufacturing tools. Below the top left is 4 Mesolithic hammer stones, and you can see how much smaller they all are. All these things are to the same scale. And on the right is a photograph of the cores, the flint cores, which were the waste remains from when they'd struck off the flakes and blades that they wanted. The smaller 3 on the top left of the photograph are the Mesolithic, and the bottom one in the middle is a Neolithic one, so you can see the comparisons. And this is what we believe Neolithic man to look like. This is a reconstruction of remains that were contained in a barrow about 1.5 miles from Stonehenge, and they have produced what they call a qualified guess of hazel eyes and dark brown hair. Again, not much different from current lockdown man. And the final period, you'll be glad to know, is the Bronze Age that we're looking at. During the Bronze Age, there was, of course, an introduction of metal tools, different forms of pottery. Cremation rituals were carried out frequently as well. This period, of course, is the one that immediately precedes the Iron Age, which is the period we started with the chariot burials. The Bronze Age, as one will determine from its title by its very nature, was about the development of metal tools, but there was, certainly at the beginning and for quite a while, there were flint tools still continued. Here are the diagnostic arrowheads or microliths of the Bronze Age, which are the classic fairy darts of folklore. They are tanged and barbed arrowheads, and as the Bronze Age continued, the standard of napping flint really deteriorated quite a lot till they just about lost the idea of what they were doing with flint, that is. But in the early Bronze Age there was really quite a change from what had become quite heavy and sluggish forms of the Neolithic. This was a group I found all together, which I take to be from a single, either a grave or a settlement site. You can see they're a little bit different in form and style, and they have with them the diagnostic tanged and barbed arrow in the bottom left of the main group there. On the left is a photograph of the underside of that beautiful plano convex laurel leaf knife, and you can see that it has patination there of an unusual nature. I am given to believe that this is probably some sort of reaction to the fabric upon which it was laid when it was buried rather than lost. These are some of the rather cruder later Bronze Age tools. As I said, they did get a bit ropey towards the end. The other thing that happened along the way was that different axes, of which there are 3 examples there, came from all sorts of different sources around the country, and if one is fortunate, beyond, although I've never found anything that was clearly come from abroad. Here we have a quartz dolerite axe on the top left, which may well have come from the North York Moors or possibly even further afield. Then there's a green mudstone one. I really don't know where that comes from. I haven't discovered it. And the other one on the right is a grey whack one, we think. Top right are pieces of axes. You do find quite a few of those, and they are ritually broken, very often thrown into water, and it has some religious significance when people died, clearly. And the bottom two have obviously been burned and were probably from a Bronze Age cremation. And here we have a more local individual, Gristhorpe Man. He was excavated in 1834 in a cliff-top burial by William Beswick, and now resides in the Rotunda Museum in Scarborough, and he is the most complete early Bronze Age skeleton that we have in the whole country. And on the left there is a computerized 3D version of what Dr. Alan Ogden thought he might look like. A typical thing that people find, if they do find things of a prehistoric nature, is a scraper. The bottom left ones are the small Mesolithic ones, the top right ones are the large Neolithic ones, and the bottom row of the main photograph are Bronze Age, all varying in size but not really that much in design. Other items which can be from any period really, which you find around the place, are top right there is a striker light. Sometimes they're called fabricators, but I think this is a striker light, along with a nodule of marcasite, and if you rub the two together you're supposed to be able to create a spark and make a fire. But on the left hand of the slide are examples of burnt flint. What they seemingly did was to put, sometimes they were pieces that had been in cremations, like the two scrapers there, but the others were pot boilers, and they heated up the stone and then they put them in the pots to heat up whatever they had in the pot as part of a cooking process. And finally, it's worth pointing out that whilst all these things are surface finds, there are limits to what one can understand from surface finds. Unless one finds a place to excavate, you can only really go on the datings and the diagnostics, because there are no organic remains to go with them that you can date accurately. You can only really go with other archaeological excavations. There are a plethora of different scientific approaches which have produced wonderful means of analysing things. The top right photograph shows some flints that have some birch bark glue still attached to them, an organic product which it might be possible to analyse. They're not in a primary context, so it may not be very reliable. And the red and green object, just to complete the circuit, is actually a form of harness ring that was picked up on the site. Well, you've all been very patient to get this far. Here is a summary, really, a very quick summary. Approximately 500 generations of people lived between the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, and of those, perhaps 2/3 of these generations were hunter-gatherers and 1/3 were agriculturalists. Climate change was the main driver for change throughout, and there was a period of severe weather that precluded any population. The first third of this period, Britain was part of mainland Europe, and then we became separated and isolated for a couple of thousand years or so. And finally, when communications were restored, agriculture and metalworking became introduced from the continental Europe. So, to conclude, 25 years of crop, field and dog walking have produced sufficient evidence to be able to answer the question. And did those feet in ancient times? Well, they did.